The forest began as a quiet hum on the horizon, the trees stretching skyward like blackened sentinels against the waning light. Hollow Pines was not a place marked on most maps, and even the locals spoke of it with hesitant whispers. They said the forest remembered, that it held the echoes of those who entered and never returned. But for Claire, it was a chance to escape the world for a few days, to wander among the towering pines and forget the constant ache of loss that had shadowed her since her brother vanished 2 years ago. She parked her car at the edge of a dirt trail, the engine ticking as it cooled in the evening air. The forest smelled damp, earthy, faintly sweet from the rotting pine needles underfoot. Claire slung her backpack over her shoulder and stepped onto the trail, feeling the soft crunch of underbrush beneath her boots. Each step seemed to be swallowed by the forest, the distant chirping of birds and rustle of leaves fading into a deep, encompassing silence. The trees grew closer together as she progressed, their branches interlacing overhead like fingers locking in a secret pact. The light dimmed quickly, a soft amber fading into shadows that reached for her as she walked. She paused to adjust her pack and noticed how still it was. Not the usual quiet of the woods, which carried distant bird calls or the creaking of branches. This was a stillness that pressed against her ears and chest, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Claire told herself it was nothing but nerves. She was alone, yes, but not afraid. Her brother, James, had loved the forest. They had spent hours hiking together as children, pretending the trees were guardians of secret kingdoms. She closed her eyes and imagined him beside her, smiling, as she had so often wished he could be. A pang of grief tore through her chest, sharp and sudden, but she forced herself forward. The trail narrowed, and she reached a small clearing. A stagnant pond reflected the dim light of the sky, the water dark and glassy. Claire set down her backpack and crouched beside it, her reflection staring back at her. She thought she saw movement in the ripples, just a flicker, but when she leaned closer, the pond lay perfectly still. The air smelled stronger here, musky and damp, with a faint undertone of something she couldn't place. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her, telling herself it was just the chill of evening. A low rustle came from the trees behind her. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the darkening forest. Nothing. Only the shadows stretching and shifting with the fading light. The hairs on her arms rose involuntarily. She whispered a small, nervous laugh, trying to reassure herself. "It's just the wind, nothing else." But then she heard a voice. Soft, tentative, familiar. Claire? Her heart stopped. The voice wasn't just any voice, it was James. It had the same tone, the same inflection she had known since childhood. She spun around, scanning the shadows, hoping to catch sight of him. The forest remained impossibly still. No figure emerged, no familiar face appeared among the trees. "James?" she called softly, her voice trembling. The word hung in the air, swallowed by the dense pines. She stepped forward cautiously, the forest floor uneven beneath her boots. Each rustle of leaves sounded amplified, like soft footsteps following her. The voice came again, closer this time, warmer, almost coaxing. "Claire, over here." She froze. Her mind struggled to reconcile what she was hearing with what she could see. This forest had been empty the entire time. No one else had entered it, and yet the voice was undeniable. It was James. With a trembling hand, she lifted her flashlight from her backpack, flicking it on. The beam cut through the gathering shadows, illuminating the clearing, the pond, and the dense underbrush beyond. But there was nothing. No figure, no movement, only the silent trees and the pale reflection of the moonlight in the water. The voice came again, this time from behind the pond. A faint figure appeared at the edge of the water. It was James, or at least it looked like him. She could see his familiar features, the tilt of his head, the mischievous glint in his eyes. He raised a hand in greeting. "James!" she cried, dropping to her knees and reaching towards him. Her voice cracked, her vision blurred with tears. "It's really you, isn't it?" But as her hand extended, the figure faltered, the edges shimmering and warping unnaturally, like a reflection disturbed by ripples in water. The smile that had once been comforting stretched too far, too wide, and the eyes, though recognizably his, seemed hollow, distant, unblinking. Claire recoiled instinctively, stumbling backward. The voice, no longer sweet, familiar, warm, became layered with static, with whispers she couldn't quite understand. Each word sounded like James and someone else, overlapping in impossible ways. The figure raised its hand again, beckoning. The movement was jerky, not quite human, yet painfully familiar. "Claire, come closer," it said, the voice splitting into multiple tones, all distorted, all wrong. Her flashlight flickered and went out. Darkness pressed in around her. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she scrambled to turn it back on. When the light returned, the figure was gone. The pond reflected only the night sky and the twisting branches above. The forest seemed alive in a different way now. The shadows weren't just dark, they moved with intent, stretching towards her, converging, retreating, always just out of reach. She stumbled backward, tripping over roots, and caught herself against a tree. Her breathing came in harsh, uneven gasps. And then she heard it. Not the voice, not yet. A low, drawn-out sigh. It seemed to come from the ground, the trees, everywhere at once. The forest was aware of her presence, aware of her longing, aware of the grief she carried, and it had decided to respond. A whisper came again, gentle, coaxing, impossibly soft. "Claire, it's me. I missed you." She froze. Her tears ran down her cheeks. Every instinct told her to run. Every memory told her to move closer. And yet the voice was seductive, weaving around her like smoke. She backed away slowly, pressing herself against a thick tree trunk. She reached for her backpack, fumbling for her phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but the device remained dead, black, unresponsive. The figure reappeared, now closer than before, emerging from the shadows between the trees. It moved silently, gliding above the ground, its form still wavering like a reflection in disturbed water. Its eyes locked on hers, and in that instant she felt the unbearable pull of familiarity, of love, of loss, a gravity she could not resist. Her voice barely escaped her lips. "James, you're real, right?" A soft, chilling laugh responded, one that carried both the innocence of her brother and a terrible, unplaceable malice. The forest leaned closer, the wind whispering through the pines like dry teeth against her skin. Claire understood then, in the pit of her stomach, that this creature, whatever it was not him. It had learned him. It had memorized every curve of his face, every inflection of his voice, every pause in his laugh. It had become what she longed for most of all, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. Her legs wobbled. She could not run yet, not until she had gathered herself. The shadows shifted around the figure, forming shapes of other lost loved ones, faces of old friends, family members, even strangers she vaguely remembered, all whispering softly, reaching out to her. Her pulse hammered. She realized she could not trust what she saw, what she heard. The forest was teaching her something terrifying. Longing could be used against her. Love could be twisted. Grief could summon a predator. And the forest, patient and endless, knew exactly how to do it. She closed her eyes, taking a trembling, silent breath. The figure remained, patient, watching, waiting. Its distorted familiarity was a promise and a threat, and Claire knew the slow, creeping terror that would follow her deeper into the forest, a forest that did not forgive and did not forget. Claire moved cautiously through the thickening forest, each step measured and hesitant. The trail she had followed earlier seemed less like a path now and more like a suggestion of direction, worn only by her own footprints and the distant memory of other travelers she could not see. The evening had deepened into night, and the shadows among the pines had grown long and distorted, twisting like smoke in the wind. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch underfoot seemed amplified in the quiet, a subtle reminder that she was not truly alone. The voice of her brother, or what had once seemed to be her brother, echoed faintly in the distance. "Claire," it called, gentle, coaxing, familiar. Her heart ached with the sound, a sharp reminder of everything she had lost. She paused, torn between the overwhelming urge to run toward it and the gnawing sense that following could be the gravest mistake of her life. Yet the pull was irresistible, a magnetic tug on her grief and longing. The forest seemed to respond to her hesitation. The air thickened, a moist heaviness that pressed against her chest. The pines leaned inward slightly, creating a tunnel of branches overhead, as if guiding her toward the voice she both craved and feared. She took another step forward, feeling the needles beneath her boots give way softly, the ground damp and uneven. Every inhalation brought the scent of wet earth, moss, and something faintly coppery that made her stomach twist. The voice came again, closer this time, clearer, layering familiarity with something just off, something she could not fully place. "Claire, I'm here," it whispered, the syllables stretching in the silence of the forest. She could almost see him in the dim light, the tilt of his head, the glimmer of his eyes, but when she blinked there was nothing, only shadows and the gentle sway of the pines in the wind. Her pulse quickened. Claire tried to call back, "James, is that really you?" But no sound emerged. Her lips moved, her voice strangled by fear, and yet the forest remained silent to her cries. The creature, she realized, had learned more than the sound of his voice. It had learned the cadence, the warmth, the pauses that made her brother real. It had built a perfect, terrifying illusion of him, and it used it to draw her in. Claire forced herself to move. She had to see it. She had to confront whatever had taken the shape of her brother. The forest around her shifted subtly with each step, shadows curling and folding over themselves. The whispers multiplied now, faint murmurs and sighs echoing from all directions, forming layers of sound that seemed almost musical yet completely unnatural. Every echo tugged at her memory, dredging up faces and voices of those she had lost or loved, mixing them with strangers she could not place. She stumbled over a root and fell forward into a patch of wet moss, her palms slick with moisture. As she rose, she noticed movement off the trail, a figure standing just beyond the reach of her flashlight. Its form was indistinct, blurred at the edges, yet it carried the unmistakable familiarity of James. Her chest tightened as she inched forward, every nerve alert. She wanted to run, she knew she should, but the longing to reach out to him, to touch him, held her frozen. The figure moved closer, gliding silently across the forest floor. Its presence distorted the air, bending light subtly around its outline. The shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing small saplings and underbrush, creating a path for it to advance. Claire's breath came in shallow bursts. Every instinct screamed that this was not her brother. Every heartbeat reminded her that she had already lost him once, and that this forest, patient and ancient, had no mercy for grief. Suddenly, the voice shifted. It was still James, and yet layered with something else, a harsh, scraping undertone, like leaves being dragged across stone. "Come to me, Claire," it said. The sound seeped into her bones, vibrating in the marrow of her arms and legs. Her hair stood on end. She tried to step backward, but the forest seemed to resist her. The pines leaned closer, their trunks pressing subtly into her path, guiding her toward the voice. A gust of wind stirred the canopy overhead, sending shadows dancing wildly across the ground. Claire's flashlight flickered and dimmed, leaving her with only the pale moonlight filtering through the branches. The figure paused, just beyond the reach of the light, its features beginning to warp as the edges shimmered unnaturally. It raised a hand in invitation, the gesture achingly familiar. She remembered the way James had waved at her on the last day they had seen each other, and for a moment she forgot the warning in her mind, forgot the fear in her chest. The forest responded immediately. Whispers multiplied, surrounding her now, coming from above, below, and all around. Each voice was slightly different, slightly off, yet eerily recognizable. Some cried, some laughed, some whispered secrets only she would know.
They tugged at her, weaving her own memories into a tapestry of fear. She shivered, realizing the forest had become more than wood and earth. It had become a trap, a mirror reflecting her own sorrow and desire. Claire stepped forward, each footfall cautiously, deliberately. She felt the wet underbrush pressing against her boots, smelled the moss, the rotting pine, the faint coppery scent again. And then the figure moved closer, resolving into something far more solid and far more terrifying than a mere shadow. Its eyes, hollow and too deep, reflected the moonlight in a way that made them look alive, as though peering directly into her soul. She reached out, trembling, as if to confirm that he was real. Her fingers brushed the air where his cheek should have been. There was no warmth, only a slight chilling mist that seemed to crawl along her skin. The voice came again, low and coaxing, almost sorrowful. "I've missed you, Claire. Don't be afraid." Her mind screamed. This was not James. Her heart wanted to believe it was. The forest had captured something, twisted it, and recreated it with the exact features she longed to see. The truth hit her with unbearable clarity. This thing fed on memory, grief, and desire. It imitated lost loved ones, crafting a trap so perfect that she could not resist. A sudden noise, a sharp crack, reverberated from the left side of the clearing. The figure flickered, momentarily unstable, and she noticed subtle inconsistencies. The tilt of the head was slightly wrong, the way the hands hung did not match the way she remembered. The eyes occasionally darkened inhumanly. She staggered back, horror rooting her feet to the ground, even as instinct screamed at her to flee. The whispers grew louder, converging into an almost cohesive chorus. They no longer spoke to her gently, they pressed against her mind, urging, demanding, weaving her own memories into a tapestry of fear. Every face she had ever loved appeared in the shadows, layered over the figure of James, until she could no longer separate the real from the imitation. Claire forced herself to breathe, her eyes scanning the clearing. The forest around her felt alive, the trees leaning slightly toward the figure, the underbrush rustling with anticipation. The creature moved again, gliding closer, its form solidifying, becoming more precise with each step. It mimicked her brother perfectly in every detail, yet she could sense the wrongness beneath, the subtle distortion that betrayed its nature. She took a final step backward, her hands trembling violently. Her voice, raw and broken, whispered, I know you're not him." The figure paused. The shadows around it seemed to still, the whispers quieting as if the forest itself was listening. For the briefest moment, the forest held its breath. Then the voice came again, layered and cruel, almost laughing. "Do you really know, or do you only want to?" Claire's chest tightened. She realized she could not rely on sight or sound. She would have to trust something deeper, her memory, her grief, her instincts. The forest was patient, it was slow, it was calculating, and it was teaching her a lesson. Desire could be weaponized, love could be used as bait. She turned and fled. The underbrush scratched her arms, the roots tried to catch her feet, the night seemed to stretch endlessly before her. Behind her, the whispers multiplied, rising in volume, layering voices she knew and voices she didn't, all calling her name, all beckoning. Even as she ran, Claire understood one thing with crystalline clarity. The forest would not let her leave easily, and whatever it had become, whatever it had learned from her memories, was already following her. Claire stumbled through the undergrowth, branches clawing at her jacket and leaves sticking to her damp hair. The forest had grown darker, as if the night itself had thickened, swallowing the faint light of the moon. The path she had followed before was gone, replaced by a tangle of roots and fallen branches that threatened to trip her with every step. Each time she thought she might have lost the creature, the soft whisper of her brother's voice floated on the wind, impossibly near, impossibly real. She paused, pressed against a wide pine trunk, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The air smelled damp and earthy, with a faint metallic tang that made her stomach nod. Every sense screamed at her that the forest was alive, that it was watching, listening, guiding her. And she knew it was true. Every movement she made was anticipated. Every heartbeat was tracked. The creature, or whatever it was, had learned her patterns, her memories, even her grief. "Claire!" The voice called again, soft and coaxing, and it echoed unnaturally through the trees. She turned in a circle, her flashlight cutting jagged beams through the darkness. The shadows seemed to shift, twisting around one another, forming shapes too fleeting to identify, yet familiar enough to unsettle her. Faces appeared in the corners of her vision, the memory of people she had loved or lost blending with strangers she could not recognize. Her pulse quickened, and a cold sweat ran down her spine. She pressed forward, stepping over gnarled roots and fallen branches. The whispers followed, growing louder, more urgent, layering voices she could identify with those she could not. The voice of James, her brother, was always dominant, pulling her deeper into the forest. The others were subtler, murmuring secrets she had buried long ago, memories she had tried to forget, emotions she had hoped to outrun. Each whisper was a thread, weaving a web that ensnared her mind as much as her feet. Claire's flashlight flickered again, plunging her into near-complete darkness. The figure appeared before her, emerging from the shadows like a reflection from the pond, solid and impossibly still. Its face was exactly like her brother's, down to the smallest detail, the tilt of his head, the curve of his smile, the familiar glimmer in his eyes. For a moment, she felt the unbearable pull of longing, the ache of grief that had haunted her for years. She reached out instinctively, trembling. But as her fingers neared its face, the edges shimmered, the features subtly distorting. The eyes darkened briefly, and the smile stretched unnaturally. It moved in ways her brother never could, limbs bending with a jerky, fluid grace that was wrong in every sense. The whispers around her coalesced into a chorus, echoing her own thoughts and fears back to her, a maddening symphony of memory and manipulation. Claire stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root, and scrambled to her feet. She forced herself to focus, reminding herself that this was not James. It could imitate him perfectly, but it was a predator, a creature that fed on longing and grief, and it had set a trap she could not ignore. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she realized that the forest itself had become the cage, the boundaries shifting and twisting to guide her towards its heart. The figure advanced, gliding silently over the uneven ground. It raised a hand, beckoning her once more, the movement almost comforting, almost familiar. Claire's chest constricted, a violent mix of fear and desire. She wanted to believe, wanted to reach out and embrace what she longed for most, but instinct screamed that doing so would be the gravest mistake of her life. The whispers escalated, rising to a cacophony of voices. Faces of the dead, of loved ones, of strangers appeared momentarily in the shadows, merging and morphing with the figure before her. The forest seemed to lean inward, branches pressing closer, creating a tunnel that funneled her attention towards the creature. The air thickened with moisture, carrying the faint metallic scent that had haunted her since the pond. Each inhale made her stomach churn, as though the forest were consuming her from the inside out. Claire turned and fled, branches whipping across her face, roots clawing at her feet. The figure followed, moving effortlessly through the underbrush, always maintaining distance, always drawing her deeper. She ran blindly, heart hammering, lungs burning, until she reached a small clearing where the moonlight spilled across the forest floor. The silence here was deceptive, a pause orchestrated by the forest itself. The shadows deepened, stretching unnaturally, and she saw movement at the edge of the clearing, more figures emerging from the darkness, all distorted, all mimicking voices she recognized. The realization struck her with chilling clarity. The forest could mimic anyone she had ever loved, anyone she had ever known, and perhaps even those she only imagined. It could craft illusions so convincing that desire and memory would betray her. Each figure advanced slowly, their movements jerky and inhuman, yet their familiarity was horrifyingly real. Claire stumbled again, falling to her knees, clutching at the wet soil. She realized the creature did not need to chase her closely. It could lure her with echoes of the past, with sounds and shapes that her mind would interpret as reality. The forest itself was its instrument, guiding her, manipulating her senses, bending her perception until she could not trust even her own memory. Claire scrambled to her feet, forcing herself to focus on the path back, on the single thread of reality she could cling to, the sound of her own breathing, the feel of the damp earth beneath her hands and feet. The figure paused at the edge of the clearing, tilting its head as though questioning her resolve. Claire felt the weight of her longing pressing down on her, a gravitational pull towards the heart of the forest, towards the creature that had learned everything about her grief. The whispers intensified, now layered over the rustling of leaves and the cracking of branches. They formed words she could understand, sentences woven from her memories. "You shouldn't have let him go. He misses you. Don't you want to see him again?" Each one struck like a knife, cutting into her resolve, testing the limits of her fear and her desire. Claire clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus on the truth she could not ignore. This was not her brother. It was not anyone she had lost. It was a creature that had learned to exploit the deepest, most vulnerable parts of her mind. It fed on her grief, her longing, her memories, twisting them into a weapon to ensnare her. She took a deep breath, the air thick and metallic in her lungs, and stepped forward into the clearing, determined to confront the illusion. The figures flinched, shifting unnaturally as though aware she was no longer following its bait. The whispers faltered, uncertainty creeping into their layered chorus. Claire's voice, raw and trembling, cut through the forest. "You are not him. You can never be him, and I will not let you take me." For a long, tense moment, the clearing remained still. The forest seemed to exhale, the branches swaying gently in the moonlight. Then slowly, the figure of James, or the creature that had assumed his form, tilted its head, a motion human enough to deceive, yet distorted enough to terrify. The shadows around it receded slightly, as though considering her defiance. Claire realized the forest had not given up. It was patient, it was ancient, and it would wait, manipulate, and hunt as long as it needed to. But she had found a spark of clarity in the center of her fear, a single truth. Desire and grief were dangerous, yes, but awareness, memory, and courage could provide a path through the shadows. Claire stepped past the clearing, moving deliberately ignoring the whispers, ignoring the figures, ignoring the lure of familiarity that tugged at her heart. Every stride was a battle, every rustle of leaves a test of resolve. Yet with each stride, she felt the threads of control she had lost begin to reassert themselves. The forest remained alive, watching and waiting, but Claire understood now. She was not entirely helpless. The shadows shifted behind her as the first faint rays of dawn began to penetrate the dense canopy. The figures of her lost loved ones flickered and wavered, fading slowly as the light strengthened. The whispers became softer, distant, like echoes retreating into the trees. Claire's chest heaved with exhaustion, and yet, amidst the fear and uncertainty, she felt the first glimmer of hope. The forest had tested her, manipulated her, haunted her grief, but she had endured. The path forward remained uncertain, the forest still a place of shadows and whispers, but Claire understood one vital truth. Survival required not just courage, but clarity, and the ability to recognize illusions for what they were. Claire moved deeper into hollow pines, her boots sinking into the soft, damp earth with each step. The forest had grown denser, the trees crowding close enough that their branches formed a nearly continuous canopy overhead, blotting out the weak moonlight. The air was thick, heavy with moisture and the faint metallic tang that had haunted her since the pond. Each inhalation carried the scent of moss, rotting pine needles, and something more, something she could not identify yet instinctively feared. It seemed to seep into her pores, cold and persistent, like the forest itself exhaling directly onto her. Every sound was amplified, the distant drip of water from unseen leaves, the rustle of small creatures scurrying through underbrush, and always the whisper, faint but persistent, "Claire." The voice was layered, almost musical, carrying the inflections of her brother's tone, yet tinged with an undertone that was alien, unplaceable, wrong. Each time she heard it, the pull in her chest intensified, tugging at her grief, urging her to follow, to surrender to the familiarity it offered. She paused at the edge of a small clearing. In the pale silver of the moonlight, she could see dozens of faces pressed against the trees, or perhaps they were part of the bark itself. Some she recognized immediately, her grandmother, her childhood friend Anna, even her brother James. But the features would shift subtly if she looked for too long, morphing just enough to unsettle her. Their eyes followed her, empty yet piercing, as though the forest were cataloging her fear. A breeze rustled the leaves, and the faces seemed to whisper in unison, soft voices layered together in a way that made her chest constrict. Claire swallowed hard and pressed forward, feeling her panic rising. She had to keep moving, had to escape the forest's pull, but the undergrowth grew thicker, snagging at her sleeves and catching her boots. Every branch seemed to twist toward her, almost deliberately, as if guiding her along a path chosen by the creature she had glimpsed before. The whispers followed her, more insistent now, weaving in words she had longed to hear and feared to remember. "Come to us. We've missed you. It's time to be together." Each phrase clawed at her mind, pulling at the fractures of memory she had tried to repair over the past 2 years. Her flashlight flickered. She pressed the switch repeatedly until the beam steadied. The circle of light revealed a narrow path leading further into the grove, framed by twisted roots and low-hanging branches. At the end of the path stood a tree unlike the others. Its trunk was impossibly wide, gnarled and knotted, with bark that appeared almost leathery. And pressed into it were faces, dozens of them, all familiar, all impossible, their features frozen in expressions of sorrow, fear, or longing. The air around the tree pulsed, vibrating slightly as though the trunk itself were alive, breathing. Claire's stomach twisted with dread. The creature, she realized, had been preparing this place for her, a final convergence of memory and illusion, a grove where grief could be weaponized fully. Every face on the tree had been observed, memorized, and reproduced to lure her deeper, to erode her resistance. Her brother's face, once warm and comforting in her memory, now stared back with a hollow, unhuman quality. Its mouth twitched unnaturally, mimicking a smile she remembered perfectly. A rustle came from behind her. She spun, heart racing, and saw movement between the pines. The figure was there again, emerging silently from the shadows. Its form was perfectly her brother's, yet its edges shimmered like mist, betraying its unnaturalness. It raised a hand toward her, a gesture of invitation that made her stomach lurch. "Claire, come closer. It's time." She shook her head violently, stepping backward. "No, you're not him. You can't be." Her voice sounded small against the vast silence of the grove, almost swallowed instantly by the whispering trees. The figure did not advance, but remained at the edge of the light, tilting its head in a way her brother never would. The air grew colder. The whispers multiplied, swirling around her, pressing against her ears and chest. They carried not just words, but emotions, pulling at the raw edges of her sorrow, dredging up grief she thought she had buried. Each step she took forward felt heavier, the ground pulling at her feet, roots curling slightly as though to trip her. The forest was alive, and it was shaping her path. Desperate to break free, Claire closed her eyes and took a deep breath, focusing on her own memory of James, not the twisted reflection before her. She remembered his laugh, the warmth of his hand in hers, the softness in his eyes. She forced herself to separate what she truly remembered from the creature's mimicry, grounding herself in reality. When she opened her eyes, the figure flinched slightly, the edges of its form rippling like water disturbed by wind. With renewed determination, she ran, her boots crunching over fallen branches and moss. The shadows seemed to stretch behind her, but the faces on the trees blurred as she moved past, their whispers fading slightly. The creature followed silently, always just beyond the reach of her light, its presence a constant reminder that the forest had not released her. She reached a smaller clearing where the moonlight was stronger, illuminating the forest floor. There, the ground itself seemed to pulse faintly, a rhythm synchronized with her heartbeat. Claire realized the forest had marked a center, a heart where it concentrated its power and its illusions. The creature's mimicry was strongest here, where the echoes of grief and longing could be turned into a nearly irresistible trap. Claire's stomach ached with dread, her legs trembling from exhaustion, but she forced herself forward. She would not allow the forest to claim her. She would not let it manipulate her sorrow. Step by step, she approached the heart of the grove, each movement deliberate, each breath steady. The whispers grew fainter, as if the forest recognized her awareness and hesitancy, but the figure of James remained at the edge of the clearing, beckoning, patient and unyielding. Finally, Claire reached the ancient tree at the center. The faces pressed into the bark seemed to stretch and distort as she approached, watching her, judging her, waiting for her to falter. She pressed a hand to the trunk, feeling the rough bark beneath her fingers, grounding herself in reality. The forest pulsed around her, alive and watchful, but she refused to give in. The figure stepped forward, gliding silently across the forest floor. Its smile was the same, its eyes familiar, but Claire met it head on. "I know you're not him," she whispered, voice steady but the trembling in her limbs. The first time, the figure paused. The edges of its form flickered, the illusion weakening slightly as if the forest were reconsidering its hold over her. The whispers receded, leaving only the faint rustling of leaves and the distant cry of an owl. Claire's chest heaved with exhaustion, but she felt the first glimmer of control. Awareness, she realized, was her weapon, recognition of the illusion, her shield. The forest remained alive, patient and eternal, but Claire now understood the rules of its power. It could lure, it could mimic, it could feed on grief, but it could not compel her to surrender if she refused to yield. She had to continue, to move deeper, to confront the heart of the forest and face the creature that had learned to imitate love itself.
Claire's legs ached, muscles trembling as she pressed forward into the very heart of hollow pines. The forest's canopy had thickened so completely that moonlight barely touched the ground, leaving only thin beams that cut through the darkness like knives. Each step felt weighted, the soil beneath her damp boots almost pulling her down, as though the forest itself resisted her progress. She kept her flashlight steady, though its weak beam revealed only glimpses of gnarled roots and twisted branches. Every shadow seemed to shift, morph, and watch her, whispering faintly through the leaves. The figure that had haunted her for hours, her brother, or rather the creature that wore his face, waited ahead. Its edges shimmered like mist in the thin beams of light, its hollow eyes perfectly mimicking the warmth she remembered. Yet every movement was wrong, too fluid, too jerky, unnaturally smooth at the same time. Each flick of its wrist, each tilt of its head was calculated to pull her deeper into the trap the forest had laid. Claire forced herself to focus on reality, on the memory of James that lived in her heart rather than the illusion before her. A low whisper echoed, threading through the trees. "Claire, don't you want to be with him?" The words were soft, honeyed, yet layered with undertones she could not place, an alien cadence that made the skin on her arms crawl. Around her, the forest seemed to lean closer, the trees bending inward to funnel the voice toward her. Faces appeared in the bark, fleeting expressions of sorrow and longing, each one distorted slightly as though the forest were rehearsing her grief in real time. Her chest tightened with both fear and defiance. She had learned that desire was dangerous here, that longing was preyed upon. Each step she had taken through the grove had tested her will,
forcing her to distinguish the memories she cherished from the false reflections the forest conjured. Now, in the center, the test reached its apex. She would need clarity, courage, and a refusal to surrender if she hoped to leave. The figure advanced silently, a phantom gliding over roots and moss. Its edges stretched slightly too wide, its eyes too reflective, its presence a hypnotic lure of familiarity. Claire's pulse thudded painfully in her ears. She thought she saw other shapes emerging from the darkness at the edge of the clearing, vague forms of people she had loved and lost, calling her, beckoning. The forest had conjured an army of illusions, each one designed to pull her deeper into despair, into submission. Claire took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she held the flashlight steady. She forced herself to remember, to focus, to anchor herself in the truths she could feel but the forest could not imitate. James had loved her, yes, but he would never speak in whispers from the shadows. He would never attempt to trap her. Her grief had been manipulated into a weapon, and if she faltered now, the forest would consume her entirely. "Stop," she whispered firmly, her voice shaking but carrying authority. "You are nothing but shadows and memory." The figure froze, its edges rippling like disturbed water. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, as if the forest itself recoiled at her defiance. Faces on the trees twisted, mouths opening and closing in silent pleas, eyes following her every move. The illusion of James raised a hand, beckoning still, but now there was hesitation in the gesture, a flicker of uncertainty. Claire forced herself to step closer, into the heart of the clearing, toward the ancient tree that had become the epicenter of the forest's illusions. The bark was lined with countless faces, pressed into its gnarled surface as though the tree had grown them over decades, perhaps centuries. She touched the rough surface, grounding herself in the reality she knew. The forest pulsed around her, a slow, rhythmic vibration that seemed in sync with her heartbeat. "Not real," she whispered to herself over and over. "Not real, not real, not real." The repetition was a mantra, a lifeline. Her brother's figure hesitated, its form flickering and warping, the perfect mimicry faltering. Around her, the faces in the bark shuddered and twitched, shadows receding slightly as her awareness strengthened. Then the figure spoke, its voice splitting into multiple layers, mocking, pleading, coaxing. "He wouldn't have left you. He wouldn't have. Come to me, Claire." The words were soft, honeyed, yet layered with undertones she could not place, an alien cadence that made the skin on her arms crawl. But Claire stood firm. Her voice rose, steady, despite the quaver of exhaustion. "I remember him, not you. You are nothing but shadows and memory." The forest trembled at her words. Branches shook violently, leaves scattering in wild gusts as though the trees themselves were writhing in protest. The figure flickered, edges melting, stretching, then dissolving into a wisp of mist. The whispers screamed in every language she knew and some she did not, a cacophony of grief and longing, trying desperately to pull her back into the trap. Claire did not retreat. She moved past the tree, past the remnants of illusion, into a narrow corridor of pines that led toward lighter ground. The forest resisted, the ground seeming to rise beneath her feet, roots snagging, branches stretching to bar her path. She stumbled, gasping, but forced herself forward, every step a defiance against the ancient will of hollow pines. Sunlight, faint but growing, began to pierce the canopy ahead. The shadows recoiled as the brightness touched the forest floor, the faces pressed into the bark, dissolving into knots in texture once more. The whispers faded into distant echoes, carrying the final remnants of their seductive calls into the wind. The creature, the mimic of her brother, had withdrawn, retreating into the deeper shadows where it would linger, patient and eternal. Claire emerged at the forest's edge just as the first full light of dawn spread across the horizon. Her clothes were torn, her skin streaked with mud and scratches, but she was alive. She looked back once toward the dark mass of hollow pines and felt a shiver of both relief and fear. The forest remained, silent now, but aware, ancient and unyielding. Its lessons had been harsh but clear. It would wait, it would watch, and it would never forget. Breathing heavily, Claire turned away, stepping onto a dirt road that led towards civilization. Each step felt lighter than the last, though the memory of the whispers and faces would linger in her mind forever. She knew that grief and longing were not weaknesses, but they could be twisted, exploited by things patient enough to wait. She also knew that recognition and awareness were her strongest weapons, that clarity could overcome even the most seductive illusions. The figure of her brother, the creature, remained somewhere deep within the forest. It would never fully vanish, for hollow pines held memory and desire like fuel, and it would continue to wait for the next wanderer, the next soul drawn by longing. But Claire had survived. She had faced the heart of the forest, and she had emerged, carrying her grief without letting it consume her entirely. The sun rose higher, brushing the world with warmth, and for the first time in years, Claire felt the ache of loss softened slightly by the hard-won strength of understanding. The forest had taught her its cruel lessons, but she had learned to walk through the shadows and return to the light.